Well, we're going to finish up where we left off last time. And as I promised, we're going to start where we left off. Well, sort of. No, we are. Let's go ahead and get rolling here. Um, Remember, we're talking about that period that runs from the, that transition period from the third into the fourth kingdom. And the Lord provides a lot of detailed information about that history in this prophecy. So we're going from the establishment of the estate of Antichrist to the rise of Antichrist in the earth. So the way Daniel 11 lays out, let's open our Bibles to Daniel 11, is it, of course, begins at the beginning of the third kingdom, of the second kingdom, with Darius and Cyrus and all that business. And then it gives us the history from Alexander to the establishment of the estate of Little Horn. And that goes through verse number 19 in Daniel 11. And then, from the time of the establishment of that estate, it takes us to the rise or the appearing of Little Horn, who is, of course, the man of sin. And we're looking at that first part from Alexander to Antiochus Epiphanes, which is the man who establishes the estate. It's kind of interesting, the parallels between Antiochus and Alexander. We'll look at a few of those parallels this morning as we continue in our study of the book of Daniel, beginning to wrap it up and get ready to move into our study of Revelation. Now, this map helps us kind of keep an orientation of what I'm talking about. So you can see the brownish, reddish section up there, the large section. That's the kings of the north. And then that green section down there toward the bottom left, that's the kings of the south. And Alexander's kingdom, as you know, was broken into four kingdoms. In Daniel chapter number 11, the Spirit brings our attention to focus on the northern and the southern kingdom, which would be the Seleucid Empire, or the Seleucid dynasty, and the Ptolemies. Ptolemies in the south, the Egyptian dynasties, and then the Seleucids in the north, or the Seleucid dynasty. So keep that in mind. When we talk about northern kings, we're talking about the Seleucid Empire. We talk about southern kings, we're talking about Egypt, basically. In 171 BC, this king of the north stood in the glorious land, remember, in Jerusalem, and he robbed the temple treasure. And he used that treasure in part to finance his campaign against the king of the south. So he robs the temple treasure and he heads south to conquer Egypt. And the rivalry between the north and the south is the focus of the whole story of Daniel chapter 11. Look at verses 18 and 19. Verses 18 and 19. Now, we've gone through all this material in some detail. Let's pick it up here at verse 18. After this shall he turn his face unto the isles. After what? Well, in the context here, it's after he has robbed the temple treasure. He's on his way now to go into Egypt to conquer Egypt. And the Bible says, after this he will turn his face unto the isles. Now, we explained this word isles. Isaiah uses the word isles to speak of the region of the Gentiles. We think of the word isle as identifying a landmass that's completely circled by water, that has a beach on every side. We don't think of an isle in the way that the word was used, well, back in the day. But Isaiah used it to speak of a landmass that includes, well, Lud and Pul, and we went through that last time. And here's the significance of this turning his face to the isles. It means that Antiochus, we've identified him already as that's the king we're talking about here. Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus for Epiphanes, he turned his face to the isles. That means that he was going to, or he intended to go and conquer the landmass that basically defined Alexander's empire, pretty much. Actually, even more. So when it says he turned his face to the isles, it signifies that his intention was to, as it were, revive Alexander's empire. He was going to go conquer all of them. Macedonia, he was going to go conquer all of that. Bithynia, the whole thing. He was going to try to revive Alexander's empire. That's what's significant about this expression, and you'll see why that's important to us as we move along. The point is then that this king of the north has vainly imagined that he's going to revive Alexandrian empire and expand it farther west even than Alexander did, because Alexander didn't go so far west as Spain. Alexander, he kind of went from his home base, which was Greece, and he went east. But now Antiochus Epiphanes has a vision to go all the way over into Spain, to bring it all under his power. Now, the estate is established. We notice that the prophecy says that a prince for his own behalf will cause the reproach offered by him, that is Antiochus 4, to cease. Look at this in verse number 18. After this he shall turn his face to the isles, and he shall take many, but a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Without his own reproach he shall cause it to turn upon him. Now, I know your eyes start rolling back in your head at some of this language because it's just a little bit weird, but when you really study it out, you begin to appreciate how perfect the language is to comprehend the history it's prophesying. And when we look at the language here, and you look for the history, the historical event that fits this history, it ends up going click. You go, oh, okay, that's why he said it that way, in order to make sure we were directed to the correct event in history that fulfills this prophecy. So it says, he shall take me, but a prince for his own behalf. That's important language, a prince for his own behalf. Now, most people believe that Leonus, the general sent by the Roman Senate to stop Antiochus from going into Egypt. Remember we talked about that. Rome had a kind of treaty with Egypt and had made a commitment to secure the throne of Ptolemy's son, this Ptolemy the fifth now, that's on the throne, a child who's on the throne now. And Rome had made a commitment to his father to secure his throne. Now, many people wonder about Rome. Joe brought a question to my attention about, well, where's Rome in all this and what's going on? Rome was not a world empire at this time. Rome was a dominant war machine, and it was beginning to gain great strength, but it was not at this time a world empire. It doesn't become a world empire by most reckoning until at the very earliest Pompey comes on the scene, and that's 64 BC. But even then, most would say Rome wasn't really even at that time an empire. It was a strong military might that began at this time in history to start exerting its influence and power here and there. Okay, that's where Rome was at this time. Rome doesn't become officially a world empire, unquestioned and unrivaled, until about 27, not about, but right at 27 BC, when Octavius becomes Augustus Caesar, and that kind of thing takes over. That happens, okay? So, at this point in history, Rome is not a world empire. It's a strong, it's like in our day, we have nations that have treaties with each other, right? So if somebody attacks one of the countries, then that other nation that has a treaty with them will step in and try to help. That's all that's happening here. So Leonus is sent by the Roman Senate to check Antiochus and to say to him, you're not going to go into Egypt. Now go do whatever you want to. You can go play in India. You can do anything you want to anywhere else, but you leave Egypt alone because we have a relationship with Egypt and we've guaranteed that throne. And that's the whole story of him drawing the circle around Antiochus and saying, make up your mind before you step out of the circle. And we went through all that. So here's what's important. Leonus was not there on his own behalf, was he? Leanus doesn't fulfill this prophecy for several reasons. One of them is Leanus was not there on his own behalf. He was there on behalf of the Roman Senate. He was commissioned by an authority over him and sent on this errand. So I don't think Leanus fulfills this prophecy. That's one of the reasons. We'll see some more as we go along. Leanus was delivering a message from the Roman Senate. It seems clear that he was acting as a representative on behalf of others and not acting on his own behalf. From reliable historical records, we know that after Leanus rebuffed him, that is Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, Antiochus IV left Egypt, and he went to Jerusalem to answer the rebellion that was going on there, that had commenced. Because earlier, when he sacked the temple, he stole the treasure, he appointed Menelaus as the high priest. Well, that offended the Orthodox Jews, the Hasidic Jews. You've heard of them. They're the guys that have the funny braids and the tangled, the little braids on their garment, prayer shawl, and they wear their hair funny and have a funny hat. All right. They are the more conservative branch of the Jewish religion, and they have a history that goes way back into this period with the Maccabean revolt and all that. So this really angered the Jewish people. That is, those who were Hasidic. The Hellenistic Jews welcomed it. Remember the Hellenizers? The Hellenizers were Jewish people who welcomed the rule of the northern kings. The Hasidic Jews resented the intrusion of the northern kings into their life and into their laws and so on, and put up a resistance that became the Maccabean revolt. Well, they didn't particularly like Egypt either, but they would take help wherever they could get it. So often they would play the king of Egypt against the king of the north. But they weren't really for the king of Egypt. They were for their own independence. And the king that would grant them that is the king that they would be more willing to serve. So you understand the dynamic here. So Menelaus was a Hellenizer. All right? He was of the Hellenistic Jews, all in favor of the rule of the northern kingdoms over them, which prophetically is so significant because we know that in the end, Antichrist rises out of that estate. The estate of Antiochus Epiphanes, the king of the north, the Assyrian. And the Jews are going to make a compact with him. It's like history repeating itself. So there are a lot of things that are going to go on right now in this history that are prescient of what's coming later at the end of the world when Antichrist is on the scene. Which is one of the reasons many people look at this and say this is the fulfillment of those prophecies, but you'll see that it's not. I already brought out one thing, that is, this Leanus was not acting on his behalf. And then this, when he rebuffed Antiochus, Antiochus turned, he left Egypt, he went back to Jerusalem because of an uprising that stirred up against Menelaus. So the Hasidic Jews deposed Menelaus and put their own priest in his place, and Antiochus is really ticked off. So he's already mad because Leanus has stopped him from doing what he wanted to do. He goes back to Jerusalem full of fury, having heard that this coup had begun there. And so he goes back, he reinstates Menelaus, and he viciously punishes the Jews for their rebellion. Now, there are a lot of interesting bits and pieces of history that pop up here that are really interesting to us, but ignored by historians generally. One of them is the fact that at this time, the book of Daniel was being circulated as a kind of tract, stirring people up to anticipate. It's almost like these books we get these days that warn us that the Lord's coming back in October, whatever it is, right? We get these books like that. This wasn't that bad, but it's that kind of a environment where everybody gets stirred up. And there's a lot of, it was very common for people to talk about this. This was the This was the expectation of the hour. That Daniel's prophecy is going to be fulfilled. So these people were doing then what we have people do today all the time. They're getting all excited and they're looking at Antiochus and going, oh, he's the Antichrist. There he is. There's the man of sin. Oh, there's the little horn. Here's the prophecy. And they're pointing to him. And there were a lot of parallels, but they're not paying attention. They weren't paying attention to the prophecy. They were loosely applying it. And that's what happens all the time. It drives me crazy. In any event, here's what's actually happened. Antiochus IV Epiphanes goes back into Jerusalem. He's angry. He starts just tearing the place up after perpetrating the horrors upon the Jews for which Antiochus IV Epiphanes has become infamous. Just like Alexander, whose example he vainly attempted to copy, Antiochus calls himself son of Zeus. So when you start getting the whole history in mind, it's interesting. You see these epochs. You get these three key epochal moments in the history of Antichrist. Alexander, who turns the kingdoms over to Satan. Then you come to Antiochus, who in so many ways appears to be fulfilling the prophecy concerning the coming of Little Horn. This guy calls himself son of Zeus. The successors to Alexander are kind of quiet about that until you get to Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Now he calls himself son of Zeus. He takes a statue of Zeus and puts it in the temple, which is very near fulfillment of the abomination of desolation prophecy of Daniel. And Jesus spoke about when you see the abomination of desolation, stand in the holy place. So you see, you can see, of course, Jesus is somewhat later. All right, about 164 years later, Jesus shows up, proving that what Antiochus did not fulfill that prophecy. Because Jesus said that prophecy was yet to be fulfilled. And he doesn't come until another 160 some odd years. Very important. So there's another proof. Antiochus did not fulfill these prophecies. All right? But it sure looks close. He calls himself son of Zeus, which is saying son of Satan, or son of the devil, Lucifer. And then he takes an image of Zeus, puts it in the holy place to desecrate it. And he commits all kinds of other egregious, blasphemous acts. He sacrifices a sow on the altar. You know, the altar of sacrifice, the brazen altar at the door of the temple. He sacrifices a sow there. And then he brings the image of Zeus into the Holy of Holies and puts it in there. It's outrageous blasphemy that goes on here. And it's patterned after the prophecy of Daniel, but it's not exact. Antiochus IV left two of his generals, Nicanor and Timotheus, to complete the suppression of the rebellion. So after he did all this stuff, he leaves two of his generals. He takes off to Persia because there's another rebellion developing in Persia. So he's off to put out another fire. According to 2 Maccabees, chapter 9, Antiochus IV enters into a temple in a village called Persepolis. It's a city in Persia. He goes there to rob its treasure. He hears that there's a great treasure there, and he follows the same pattern he did with Jerusalem. He goes to Persepolis, and he enters that city, and he attempts to rob it of its treasure. However, in Persia, when Antiochus IV attempted to ravage Persepolis, a little-known and weak people, the keepers of their city and temple, attacked him and beat him. A little-known and weak people. He had every reason to expect his vast army would walk through there and just wipe him out, but they beat him. They beat him back. He couldn't get their treasure. At that time, history tells us that Antiochus decided to go home, to go back to his fortress. Now, the reason this is important is because When Leonidas rebuffed Antiochus there near Egypt, Antiochus didn't turn his face to his own fortress. He turned his face to Jerusalem. So it doesn't fit the prophecy. He goes to Jerusalem. He commits all these outrageous, abominable practices against the Jews, or these outrageous effronteries of the Jews and blasphemy against God. And then he leaves 2 of his generals there to continue suppressing the people and breaking down that rebellion. And he goes to Persia now, to a little city, tries to attack a virtually unknown group of people that are in Persepolis. And that little village beats him, beats his army. Of course, they didn't destroy his army, but he couldn't defeat him. You know, it takes overwhelming force to overcome a well-defended position, right? You know that. And so we can understand how this kind of thing can happen, but nevertheless, this is really surprising. And obviously, that caused Antiochus to turn his face toward his fortress and to return in shame. Verse 19. Then he shall return, then shall he, we'll get it right if I keep trying, so be patient with me. Then he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. Now listen to that, not be found. Isn't that weird? Once again, you'll have occasion to see how, when you read the language in the prophecy, it sounds a little strange, like it's not really saying anything. But when you find the history that fulfills the prophecy, you go, of course it was worded that way. That's perfect. So watch what happens here. He turns his face toward his own fortress. Well, that means his own fortress, not somebody else's fortress. So again, when he left Leonidas, he didn't turn his face toward his own fortress. He turned his face toward Jerusalem. So it doesn't fit the prophecy. So we're looking for another anecdote in history that might fit the prophecy. It's an anecdote in history that historians generally have ignored. It's practically a footnote in some obscure history that it took digging like you wouldn't believe to find this, but all of a sudden I went, oh, look at this. So he goes to Persia. He attacks this little unknown town. The unknown town beats him. And that prince, by the way, would be acting on whose behalf? His own. How about that? Yeah, the prince of Persepolis resisted Antiochus and acted on his own behalf. So it fits the prophecy. He rebuffs him and sends him with his tail tucked in shame and reproach. There would not be a whole lot to be ashamed of if Rome, the great power of Rome, stepped in and said, I don't want you going into Egypt. But if some little unknown weak city whoops what you are imagining is the greatest army in the world, you're going to get somewhat disheartened. It fits the prophecy perfectly in every particular. So he's going to return in shame. Now here's what happens in the history. At Ecbatana, he received news that the Maccabees had defeated Nicanor and Timotheus. It's just getting worse and worse for this guy. Again, one bad news after the next, you know. So he gets whooped by this little town. He's on his way back to his own fortress. He gets word that the 2 generals he left in Jerusalem have been beaten by the Maccabees. Well, the history record tells us he went out of his mind in rage. It was too much for the vain king. He flew into rage. He declared his intention to make Jerusalem a burying ground for the Jews. Kind of sounds like Hitler. But he made his decision that he's going to wipe the Jews out completely. He's going to go into a total anti-Semitic mode. Well, he was already there, but he's in full-blown rage now. As he was on his way back to Jerusalem to carry out this purpose, he was smitten with a loathsome disease. We're not told what the disease was, but we know it made his body stink so that his generals didn't want to be around him. It's pretty weird. Well, determined nonetheless to carry out his evil purpose, this guy's so obsessed. It's kind of like, Trumpophobia or Trump rage, the same kind of phenomenon here. This guy's so outraged, crazy in his rage, that he is going to go, and he stumbles when he's trying to get into his chariot. He stumbles out of the chariot, and he got such exceeding wounds it weakened him further. I'm using the language of the historical resource here I used. And his disease ate away at his body, making him stink, repulsing his soldiers. I mean, he's in a mess. He's really having a bad day. Now, according to the Maccabees, Antiochus IV acknowledged this judgment came from God. That's the rumor that went out. And that he attempted to repent, but God refused him. That's what the Maccabees say about it. So I'm drawing from a couple of different sources here. But the Maccabees weigh in on it right there. Thus he died in an unidentified mountain in Persia. And his body was carried away by one of his generals to an undisclosed place. And so he was not found. See? When you first read the verse, you go, man, this teaches you so many things beyond the interesting story we have here. It teaches you how to handle your scripture. When you're reading Bible, pay attention. Don't be satisfied if some anecdote of history sort of fits. If it only sort of fits, it doesn't fit at all. It has to fit on every particular. Now, there can be some things in the prophecy you don't find in the history. And there can be some things in the history you don't read in the prophecy. But there can't be something in the history that is out of phase with the prophecy. You can't have that. So if the guy didn't turn his face to his own fortress, well then, oops, we're out of phase here. The prophecy and the historical anecdote are not matching right there. They're breaking away. There's some breakaways here. And then they have to kind of fudge. You know, I work with Photoshop sometimes because I'm building some kind of an image or whatever, one of my book covers or something. Anyway, so you have what's called a smudge tool. How many of you ever work with Photoshop and you know what I mean? Yeah, you got a smudge tool. And it's really useful, isn't it? Because you can take that tool and kind of blend in the edges and take two images and put them together and make them look like one image if you do it very carefully and play around with it. Well, don't do that with the Bible, okay? God didn't provide us a smudge tool to make the Bible fit history. We need to be careful about that. It needs to fit. Again, there can be things in the prophecy you can't find in history. That can happen. It can also happen that there are some things you see in a story that aren't included in the prophecy concerning the story. For obvious reason, it will be an awfully big book. It's already a pretty good sized book. But if he had to put everything in there, it would really be big. So he puts enough in there so you can make the connection. But what you got to watch out for is an event in the prophecy, an event in the historical story that is out of phase with the prophecy. And I pointed out three things that are out of phase between the story of Antiochus and the prophecy concerning Little Horn. So he was not found. Well, that fits perfectly the story of Antiochus Epiphanes, but it doesn't fit the story of when he was in Jerusalem. It fits the story of when he came out of Persepolis. That's the story that fits the prophecy on all points and is not out of phase anywhere. So it's reasonable to suggest this is the historical answer to that part of the prophecy found in Daniel 11:18 that tells us, a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Now there's another thing, another out of phase situation. When Antiochus left Laonus and went on north into Jerusalem and delivered the reproach upon the people of the Jews, he delivered it. He didn't attempt to deliver it and then was unsuccessful. He delivered. He attempted to deliver the reproach upon the prince of Persepolis, but couldn't. You see? It just keeps piling on. Pretty soon the theory that Antiochus fulfilled this on the shores there, going into Egypt, it just crumbles. It begins to fall apart. It just doesn't work. He was not sort of acting as a prince on his own behalf, and the reproach He didn't stop the reproach. That didn't stop Antiochus from delivering his reproach upon the Jews. He went from there and totally delivered the reproach. So it's almost overkill to keep going with this, but it just doesn't work. The prince of the city of Persepolis would certainly be acting on his own behalf when he led his people to revolt against the attempt of Antiochus to pillage their temple. And having no reproach of his own, he did indeed turn the intended reproach offered by Antiochus upon his own head. So it all fits when you think about this prince of Persepolis as opposed to the prince that was sent by Rome. In fact, the above historical anecdote concerning the fall, or the aforementioned historical anecdote concerning the fall of Antiochus IV, fits perfectly the prophecy in every particular, and also fits it more comfortably in another important particular point. After Laenus peremptorily dismissed Antiochus IV from his designs on Egypt, Antiochus IV did not turn his face. See, but I already brought that up. I got ahead of myself. Rather, we know he was determined to go into Jerusalem and then had designs to go into Persia to quell unrest there. So, in other words, he wasn't done then. He was on his mission. He was just continuing on with his rampage across the land, trying to secure his empire. The prophecy suggests that immediately after his humiliation, he turned his face toward his own fortress, and that is exactly what happened in Persepolis. Okay, I guess I did get quite a bit ahead of myself, but we'll catch up. The humiliation Antiochus IV received at the hand of Laenus, a general in the service of the already mighty Roman Senate with an army renowned for its power, can hardly be compared to what he must have experienced when a little-known and small city was able to rout him. So Daniel 11:20, let's get there. Daniel 11:20, the Bible says, "Then shall stand up in his estate." That language is important to us because it tells us that some estate has been established. The estate of the aforementioned king of the north, who fulfilled the prophecy we just talked about. Or in other words, Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV, we're talking about his estate now. So the estate out of which Little Horn's going to come has now been formally established. And that makes sense. Because finally Little Horn kind of comes out of that estate, doesn't he? He established that estate with blasphemous activity against the Jews. He established that estate with putting an image, a false god, in the temple itself. You see what I mean? That's the estate out of which Little Horn's going to come and rise to power. He's going to, as it were, inherit that estate. And that's exactly what's going to happen. Then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom, but within few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. And in fact, that's what happens. Antiochus IV Epiphanes' successor is a child, and he's under the care of one of the generals. And interesting thing, I wonder if I go into that here. I'm not sure if I think I stopped right there. Yeah, with the estate established. I think I've stopped here for this lesson. With the establishment of the estate. And then out of that estate is going to rise Little Horn, and I'll go into the history that extends from the establishment of the estate of Little Horn to the rise of Little Horn in that estate, beginning in our next lesson. So the estate is established. Then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom, but within few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. Amen. Hallelujah. We finally got that first section done. That was really a lot of work. But Daniel 11 is, I tell you, it takes some work to get through that. But it's so satisfying when you take the time to study and to find the historical event that actually fits the prophecy. Then it's like, wow, that's great. And this has been, kind of my testimony throughout my study of prophecy, given a lot of information by those who taught me and all the books that I read, huge amount of information. Obviously, if I didn't have all that supporting me, I would not have been able to go to the next level with this. But what always bothered me are some of these things. We were going through Daniel and kind of running through Daniel 11 with this superficial template just kind of put over it saying here, 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 here. And then when I looked at it more closely, I kept having these questions. Like, for example, I would read that, I'd read the history, I go, but Antiochus didn't turn his face to his own fortress when he left Laodicea. So I'm just being honest with myself and with the Lord, really. In my studies, I'm saying, Lord, this doesn't fit that prophecy. Now, my experience with your word is it always fits. So there's something wrong here. What is it? And it took years of study and research to finally dig some of these things out and go, oh, there it is. Amen? Why does God hide stuff like that, and make you work to get it? I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is he wants us to study to show ourselves approved. He wants us to do that. Okay, well, we finished the lesson for this morning. And we're 10 minutes before time to be done. Would you like a little review? Okay. All I needed was one yes. Okay. So I anticipating that this might happen, I'm ready for you. Okay. So, the 7 candlesticks of Revelation. Now we're getting you ready for Revelation. All right. And we're starting to show how the merge happens between Daniel and Revelation. In the period of the 7 churches, certain prophetic events given to us in Daniel can be expected to be fulfilled or will be fulfilled. Many of them have already been fulfilled. And those 7 golden candlesticks indicate 7 phases in the development of the Lord's churches, progressing from the death of the last apostle to the coming of the Lord for his church. Now, we'll get into that some more later on. I've already written extensively on it. It's available to you online. If you enrolled for this course, you should have received, among the documents you got, Revelation covering chapters 1 through 3. If you didn't get that, let me know and I'll make sure you get it. But it's a free download to anybody who enrolled in our class. It's a PDF-I, which means it's interactive. I think it's a PDF-I. It's at least a PDF. But all that information is there, and it's extensive. It's like 400 or 500 pages of notes covering chapters 1, 2, and 3 of the book of Revelation. So there's a lot of material there. To give you an overview, those letters to the 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3 provide an overview, a kind of bird's eye look at the development of the Lord's churches from the time of the last apostle to the time that he returns for us. During that period of time, we're living in that history right now, by the way, and many of us believe we're in what we call the phase or the era called Philadelphia. Others would argue, no, we're way deep into Laodicea. Well, it depends on how you look at it. It depends on how you interpret it. And I certainly do believe we're at the border, all right, where you've got some Philadelphia and Laodicea elements mixing together right now. There are still some Philadelphia churches, but there are a lot of Laodicean churches or Christians. And we're going to look at that in a message I'll preach on that subject as we get nearer to our study on Revelation. But here are some prophecies from Daniel that we should expect, very likely, to see during the time of the churches. And one of them is the rise of the 4 beasts. The first beast that Daniel saw was a lion that had the wings of an eagle attached to it. And then those wiggles, that's the wings of an eagle, all put together into wiggles, okay? When the eagle's wings are plucked off of the lion, and then it stands upright and is given the heart of a man. Now that clearly indicates a dramatic, a profound transition occurs in whatever country is depicted by the lion. For reasons we've already laid out, we believe the lion represents the first of the 4 kingdoms that Daniel saw, or that Daniel interpreted for Nebuchadnezzar in his dream. The first was Babylon, the Babylonian Empire, and the second was the Persian Empire. The third was the Grecian Empire. Then there's the fourth kingdom, which we call mystery, for reasons that we've labored to help you understand. So this is the first one. However, Daniel 7, which is the vision of the four beasts, is not simply a recasting of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. We know that what happens in Daniel 7 is this. Daniel gets a vision that progresses from Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that forecast the development of history from the time of Nebuchadnezzar till the stone comes, Jesus Christ, and sets up the kingdom that is eternal. What Daniel does in Daniel 7 is he focuses on the period that we call the feet. He talks about the time at the end when Little Horn shows up. That's what he's talking about. So what he's doing is he's showing us something about these kingdoms in the way they will appear at the time of the end. So the time of the end is that period when Antichrist shows up. We know from Daniel's prophecy that Antichrist shows up, makes his debut, as it were, on the prophetic stage when he takes out 3 horns of the 10-horned beast. That's when he officially begins fulfilling his prophecy. And I believe that's the revelation of the man of sin. So he takes out those 3 horns on the 4th beast. Now, the Bible says that when that 4th beast is destroyed because of the big mouth of Little Horn, the other 3 beasts will be given a stay of execution. Their kingdoms will be taken from them, but they will be allowed to continue. Now, what that means is all 4 of these beasts are on the scene at the same time. That's important because it means that Daniel 7 is not kind of recasting Nebuchadnezzar's dream and looking at it from a different point of view and adding insight. So we're saying, this is Babylon, this is Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, the lion, that's Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, the bear, that's Cyrus, Persia, the leopard, that's Alexander's Greece. No. It's talking about how those kingdoms look at the time of the end. The idea has been in the mind of many that Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom is here and then it disappears. And then comes Cyrus' kingdom. And it disappears. Then comes Greece. And it disappears. And then, no. Even in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, they're all there. When the stone comes, and the stone falls upon the feet, and it goes on to say, and beats the gold, the silver, the iron, the brass, beats it all to pieces. It's all there. So the kings don't disappear, or the kingdoms don't disappear. They just lose the kingdom. Okay? That's all that's happening. And it finally comes to the 4th kingdom. During the period of the 4th kingdom, as you know, this stuff is going to happen. That first kingdom, Babylon, is going to rise, and something amazing is going to happen. It's going to change in its fundamental character or nature. It'll go from a beast-like people to a humane-like people. This happens after they've had the wings of an eagle attached to it. Now, in our day and age, it's almost impossible not to think of America there. And I can tell you that the lion most certainly is Iraq. Why? Because Iraq is the modern day name of the geography that was Babylon. In fact, Hussein tried to rebuild Babylon. Did you know that? Hussein was rebuilding Babylon just up till the point that he was found buried in a little hole somewhere cowering. Wasn't that fun? That was great. That was great news. So that's already being tried. There's already an effort right now to rebuild Babylon. Now we know from prophecy in Revelation 18, we're connecting Revelation. We're beginning to get you ready for the transition here. Revelation 18 tells us that Babylon will be the economic center of world commerce at the time that Antichrist is on the scene. So we see the beginnings of that when Iraq begins to rise, when the wings of an eagle get attached to it, when the wings of that eagle are plucked from it, and then that beast stands up and experiences a profound transformation and becomes man-like instead of beast-like. Contemporaneously with this, or just coming right behind that, would be the rise of the bear. And the bear, of course, is Media, Persia. That's Russia and Iran. Russia and Iran. I won't take the time now because I'm coming up to the conclusion, but there's a connection between Russia and China and Iran and China. There's kind of a trifecta there. And they've been connected very closely for a very, very, very long time, deep into history. So there's good reason to believe that these three ribs in the mouth of this bear, it's this bear representing the spiritual dominion that's forming here out of this second kingdom, is going to have in its mouth China, Russia, and Iran. Very possible. Then there's going to be some developments in the area of Greece. And the four-headed leopard here represents, of course, the division of Alexander's empire into four kingdoms, however, brought together again. There's going to be a unity in the European nations, bringing them together in this figure of the four-headed leopard with the four wings of the fowl. So that's going to be a rising, or kind of a recombining of Alexander's empire. That's going to set the stage for Antichrist to come up to power, because he comes from one of those heads. He comes from one of those kingdoms indicated by the four heads of the leopard, and we know which one. The one in the area of Lebanon, Syria. So we can narrow this thing down. It gets really, really interesting. Then the next thing to develop will be the Western powers will become like policemen of the world. And by default, we go to the Western powers because we've got everything else covered. With the lion, with the bear, and with the leopard, all the rest of the world is covered. All that's left is the Western powers. So we do tend to kind of do it that way. There are some other more subtle reasons that we would suggest that this is representative of the Western powers, and that would be the connection between this thing and Rome. The connection between the fourth beast and Rome. They're not friendly to each other, as we'll see. In any event, when this happens, the Western powers will rise up and just start stomping on everything. And the tendency is to think they're going to be a really bad people. Maybe not. It becomes that, but in the beginning of that, it's very probable and actually more likely that this Western power will be the rod of God, the sword of the Lord, executing vengeance upon evildoers all over the world. But more on that later. You're going to love it. It's very interesting. Let's stand together.